So today I will be basically giving you a lecture on Indian society, basically about how Indian society has been studied and what are the various representations of Indian society, sociologically studied, and what are the various representations of Indian society that we have, which also dominate our public life. So you will find some sort of, reverberation of that. Some of the debates that I will talk of, you will realize that they are very much present in our public life and part of your news channel prime time discussion that happens. And many of these representations get reproduced. And how cyclical our representation of Indian society is. And somehow I think my own assumption is that we are caught by the very representations that the British created for us and are really not able to come out of it, sort of caught in a time warp. So that's going to be my conclusion, but I will reach to that conclusion systematically. All right? So India, as we know, is known for its diversity, people of various linguistic, religious, social, economic, and cultural backgrounds. So there's a statement very famous about India, that whatever statement is made about India, the opposite is equally true. So if you're going to say that India is traditional, there are enough avenues to show that India is modern and not really traditional. And if you were to look at tradition itself, you will realize there are a lot of contradictions within that tradition, a lot of conflict within that tradition. So for most people, India is like a conundrum. How do you understand and explain India? What is India about? And many scholars for over 200, 300 years have been trying to understand that. Travelers who have come to India have written about India, very kind of intrigued by the diversity they saw, the sort of specializations, economic specializations they saw, occupational specialization they saw, social differences that they saw, and yet the fact that the society was working as a whole. So India's always been very kind of perplexing for most people. If you were to ask even your friends who are sitting here, who come from outside of India, they are completely lost in terms of how to understand India. And of course, efforts have been made to understand it from time immemorial, but I start with the British because I think some of the most systematic studies on India really emerge with the coming of the British, right? So it really starts in the middle of the 19th century in the writings of travelers, missionaries, and civil servants. Studies were undertaken mainly by British civil servants responsible for administering large and unfamiliar populations. So when they came to India, they just traveling from north to south, to east to west, the sort of diversity that they saw, the number of groups, communities that they saw, the sort of traditions, cultures, differences in lifestyles, dress, food. It became impossible for them to really comprehend how to govern in India as, to govern a country as complex as India. And I think it was the demand of governance itself that forced them to make sense of India. They wanted to really catch the pulse of India. What is India about? Is there something that we can say that, yes, this is India, and in that frame, try and bring in all that diversity that you see, so that then you can come up with policies and ways of administering this large mass called India and bring in your own, system or revenue systems and other systems into place, right? So descriptive and detailed information, various castes and tribes, starts by the middle of the 19th century. The first census operation was in 1872 and carried out after every 10 years from 1881 onwards. And this is when they started taking details about caste and tribes in India. And many communities were asked to really kind of give information on their caste. And this is where the politics of caste really first emerges, because many castes return themselves as forward castes. Those castes who were not forward returned themselves as forward castes. And it so happened that later, by 1831 or whatever, when the caste census happened, many of them reverted to being backward caste. So there was this politics of mobility that really, the census unleashed. But the biggest, I think, consequence of these census operation was it put a stamp on India in terms of these morphological categories of caste, tribe. Right? And we have never been able to come out of that, because they are the one who sealed India into various caste communities. And those categories have remained with us. And we still think of India in terms of those morphological categories, even if we try to disrupt those categories and say that no, actually caste is not as uniform as we think it is, or it's not as homogeneous as we, understand it in a textual term. It really functions very differently in reality, and yet we still work with those categories. And it's one of the reasons why I suppose even your module 1 is structured around those lines, because that is the sort of information that has emerged on India. The British set the frame of understanding India, and caste really became this, this all monumental category through which to understand India. To the extent that there was this entire debate on whether non-Hindus in India have caste. And now, of course, given the politics of reservation, it has become, an issue where the people who are low caste in other communities are seeking reservation and claiming caste status, lower caste status, right? So, just to give you a sense of the people who did these studies, were Denzel Ibbotson, it was 1883, Nesfield, Risley, Crook, Thurston. Thurston has this excellent volume, if you're ever interested in studying South India, on caste and tribe. Sort of description that I think no scholar after that on South India might have produced. Phenomenal description, of the remotest of communities that you can find in the jungles. Thurston has reached, obviously with his assistants, he had Indian assistants because they didn't know the language, so usually they would have an upper caste assisting them, who knew the language and also could translate it into English. And so this medium of translation became the basis of bringing out many of these. And many scholars have argued that also brought in a lot of bias against, the lower caste and tribes who were being studied, because the upper caste influence kind of led to colored the sort of information that was fed in that. So it's a controversial issue, but the fact remains that some of the best works were brought out by the British, highly descriptive, highly informative. Risley specifically stands out because he's the one in 1891 who specifically came out with the racial theory of caste, to argue that the upper caste belonged to another race. They were the Aryans, right? And the lower castes, or the Shudras, were Dravidian. So there is this divide that he brought in and really kind of argued in favor of a racial theory of caste. Now that theory was later challenged and also dismissed by a very famous professor belonging to Mumbai, or Bombay as it was known then. He even has a street named after him in Mumbai, Professor G.S. Ghurye. Now he's the one who kind of repudiated that and said that no, it is not, caste does not have a racial origin, but is cultural in nature. And he compared the upper castes of South India, the Brahmins of South India and of North India, to argue that the North Indian Brahmins had more in common with the North Indians non-Brahmins than with the South Indian Brahmins. So he said that there was no racial basis to, caste at all. It's a cultural phenomenon. And thereby I think really kind of, pitching it at a level where you don't fix caste. Once you fix it on the basis of race, then it becomes very difficult to even challenge it, because there is a physiological basis on which you've done it. So he sort of he being a nationalist scholar who was seeking to find unity in the diversity there was, even in the stratification that was evident in India, he tried to sort of break that and argue that it's cultural, and in being cultural, malleable, right? So you can actually break the caste system if it's cultural. If it's racial, it becomes all the more difficult. Of course, later you have Dalit scholars who have brought up this point again of saying that caste actually has a racial basis, which again was countered by another famous sociologist, André Bette. This was in the 1990s, who said no, that is not the case. And so finally what's happened is this entire debate has gone into a highly political kind of realm, where it becomes very difficult to say that this is it. It's also which kind of sort of interpretation that you hold on to. This was then there was Hutton, G.H. Hutton. Reason I've mentioned him here is that he was a civil servant who did a caste and tribe series, but also later became the professor in social anthropology in Cambridge. Now he's somebody, many of these civil servants were also, their works are considered as very solid, sound anthropological work. So you can see a clear nexus between anthropological writing, political requirements, administrative requirements. So you realize that much of the information that was produced in India was in the context of governance, part of politics, right? It was not like independent, neutral sort of information that was being collected, research for research's sake, but research primarily with the agenda of governance in mind. This was one set of writing. Another set of writing that really came up at that point in time was a theoretical, slightly more theoretical pieces of writing. I'll only name two people. Many of you might not be familiar, so I'm not going into details of that. Just to touch upon it, one is Max Weber. He was a German. He was somebody who was interested in understanding the rise of capitalism in the West. He was interested in understanding the rise of capitalism in the West. And he had argued that one of the reasons why capitalism arose in the West was really not because of certain economic or material reason, but because of ideological reasons. And what was that ideology that triggered the capitalism in the West, according to him? It was Calvinism, a form of Protestantism, which, sort of encouraged work as a form of worship. And when you're successful in work, automatically you're considered as the chosen one by God. So your work becomes your calling. So as a capitalist, you cannot hoard capital. You have to invest. Capitalism runs on investment, right? So it is to constantly run on investment. So his argument was that Calvinism actually created what he called what he termed as this worldly asceticism. So it was asceticism, but of this world. So you're putting back money into this world, and that is what generated capitalism. So in that context, he started comparing other parts of the world, like Asia, in which he looked at China and India, and he argued how India specifically lacked that ethic, and that India was essentially otherworldly because of the karma and dharma theory that they had, that this whole idea of death and rebirth, somehow capitalism cannot develop. So he had this sort of a framework, and he kind of juxtaposed India to the West, right? Then there was Louis Dumont. Louis Dumont is a very famous name. I think much of sociology in India has been sort of a rejoinder to what Dumont had to say about India. Now he was somebody who's also considered as an Indologist. What do I mean by an Indologist? Indologist is someone who bases much of his study on the study of sacred texts, written records, right? Sanskritic texts. And he did also some bit of field work. And it's on that basis that he arrived at a particular understanding of India to argue that one of the most fundamental institution that stands apart in the study of India is caste, right? So he said, And what is the caste system? Caste system is a system which is based on the principle of purity and pollution. You're aware of the caste system, aren't you? Right? Basis of what's the principle of purity and pollution, where the pure castes are at the top of the hierarchy and the impure castes are at the lower part of the hierarchy. And what is the hierarchy like? Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. And then there is this category called the Jana, who really are outside the caste system, who we also known as ex-untouchables. Even tribes are included in those. So those were a category who were outside of the caste system. So he very strongly proposed caste as the institution to study, and he was considered as a conservative. He was considered as a conservative for the reason that he presented a Brahminical understanding of caste, because much of his reading of caste really emerges from religious texts, which were largely of the Brahmins, right? So, however, if you read some other writings of his, it doesn't seem so, because he felt that unless and until you recognize caste as the fundamental institution in India, there is no way you can even challenge that institution. You need to recognize how totalizing caste is, how it permeates every dimension of life of Indians across religions, across Hindu, Muslim, Sikhs, everybody. And so he said that unless and until Indians or the nationalists wake up to that fact, there is no way that you can make India into a modern society. Right? So for him, he felt that the prerequisite for that, for India to become modern, is to recognize caste as a fundamental institution. Right? But this view was considered by nationalist scholars, among whom was M. N. Srinivas, I'm sure you've heard of him, G.S. Ghurye. These were the national scholars who were his contemporaries, who felt it was a totalizing view. And totalizing in which sense? One, because it's text-based, and second, it accorded a sense of universality and timelessness to caste. Right? The fact that caste is like being there for centuries and that it is unchanging. So the representation of Indian society really emerges at this point in time by these two sets of writing, especially the theoretical part of writing, which sees India as traditional. And mind you, when I say traditional, I'm defining tradition every time I use it, because I want you to realize that even when we use the word tradition loosely, how dangerous it can be. Because the meaning of the word tradition has also changed over a period of time. Now, when I say they rendered India as traditional, it was basically, tradition was defined as a state of near integration, stability, individual immobility prevailing for endless centuries. Timeless, as if caught in a time warp, not moving. And completely conceptually opposite of the West. West believed in achievement, India believed in ascription. West was class-based, India was caste-based. Individual is the center of, the Western imagination. Community is the center of the imagination of India. So India kind of stood opposed. In fact, he went on to argue that in India, the only individual kind of, assertion, individualism that you see is outside of the caste system, of the sannyasi. Sannyasi is the only one who has no caste, right? Otherwise, everybody who is part of Hinduism will have caste, will belong to some community. So there was a stress on finding the quintessence of India. As I said, the pulse of India. What is it that, that India is about? So what was prioritized, yet again, was the morphological structure rather than the normative structure of Indian society. And what was the morphological structure all about? It was about caste. Whereas the normative structure, you realize, is not just about caste. There are various dimensions of hierarchy and difference that you find in India as a part of local traditions in India. But that was really not considered. Caste really emerges as this gatekeeping concept, as a concept that any foreigner, if were to come to India, I think if they are not aware of anything else, they'll be aware of caste. So till date. So that kind of caste emerges as this very fundamental category. Right. What do I mean by morphological structure? Something that the members of society carry in their minds, structures through which one thinks of one society. Right? Something that frames an idea. So morphology is that skeletal which brings everything together for you. Caste really emerges as that. Right? So caste is the key to understanding India and its value orientation, holistic and hierarchical, permeated every dimension of life. So this is what is the picture that emerges like by the early 20th and mid 20th century also, and it somewhat stays with us even now, frankly, is this Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, this sort of a model where Aryans are associated with the twice born. You know what twice born are, right? And the Shudras, twice born, are the ones who actually go through the thread ceremony and who are actually re-initiated into this world, into the Hindu fold. They're considered as twice born. And the Shudras are ones who don't go through that. They go through their own initiations, but not the Brahmanical one. And so they are seen as non-Aryans. Of course, there have been studies. There's somebody called Renfels. Very few people know him. He wrote in the 1940s. He, in fact, even proposed this idea of non-Aryans and Aryans, and he has this fantastic book which I had dug out recently for my own research, and I was fascinated when I read it, where he argued that India was primarily a country of matrilineality. And it was really this matrilineality was challenged by the Aryans, after the invasion of the Aryans, who were pastoral nomads, who were also patrilineal. They came with their system, and gradually matrilineality gave way to patrilineality, to the point that he says that initially the Aryans actually co-opted many of the matrilineal aspects into their system. So you find remnants of matrilineality even in the patriarchy that we have. So the cult of the mother goddess, puberty rights for girls. And there are still pockets, at least when he wrote, there was still very strong concentration of matrilineality in India, in the south and in the northeast. Many tribes and many communities in the south, including Hindu communities, non-Brahmin communities, were burying their dead, right? And were practicing matrilineality. There was polyandry. So he actually traced and showed how, so this kind of version of India, of dividing India into Aryan and non-Aryan, really got consolidated in the psyche of, the scholars, and how they kind of projected India. Okay, so Indian scholars generally were not very comfortable with this projection of India being a caste-based society. Just wake that guy up, or just put something in his mouth. क्या यार, हम मेहनत करके आए हैं पढ़ के पढ़ाने के लिए, और तुम सो. Not fair, ना? फिर इंडिया के बारे में बात हो रही है. This is very interesting facts. These are things about, you need to know, because there's so much of faff that goes around about India. We don't even know how we know about India. And you will realize that there's nothing sacrosanct about whatever's been said about India. You realize there's a politics behind everything. And that's why when every time one opens our mouth about India, we should know where we stand. You can have a stand, but you should know where that stand is coming from. And one of the reasons why I'm doing this sort of an exercise with you is primarily for that. I'm just giving you the frame to understand how these debates came out in India, right? So I would like you to be awake and listening. Okay, so Indian scholars basically were not comfortable at all of looking at caste as this gatekeeping concept, and questioned it and underplayed it. For example, M. N. Srinivas came up with this concept of the field view as against the book view of India. Said, let's forget caste. I mean, it's not even caste. I mean, nobody says, what caste are you in India? People will say, what is your jati? Right? And jati really does not translate into caste. Jati actually can be sub-caste. Right? There was a point in time where the Iyengars will not look at the Iyers, and the Iyers will not bear the sight of the Iyengars. Even in Chembur right now we have two temples, one of the Iyengars and one of the Iyers. The Ahabala Mat of the Iyengars and the Shingeri one of the Iyers. The Iyengars will not go to that Iyer's temple, and the Iyers will not go to the Iyengari temple. Right? So the field view kind of gives you a completely different picture of how, caste works in reality. And so they were saying that no, it is not just about purity pollution. You need to understand cultural differences. You need to understand, denominations, different sects, different ways of worship, different gods you believe in. It's not about distinguishing between me as a human being against you as a human being. Say, for example, among the Brahmins, probably it could just be the fact that I believe in Vishnu and you believe in Shiva. And so there is a difference between being Hindu and practicing Hinduism, right? So that is the sort of an argument that our nationalist scholars were making. Not everybody, even within India, accepts it, but that was one of the dominant kind of arguments that were made. Right? Now, there was two sort of an engagement that you find of the Indian scholars vis-a-vis India. One was in relation to colonialism, and then in relation to the future of Indian society. So on the one hand, they were very aware of all the social evils that existed in India, and these were the new elites. These were the English-educated elite that the British had produced in India. People who had obviously, in some senses or the other, distanced themselves from traditional India, right? And had emerged as a separate class altogether. So they were also very critical of many of the practices which they thought was obscurantist in India, right? But on the other hand, they also, had a sense of belonging to India, and thanks to the British, who systematically produced data about India, translated much of the works about India, and mind you, initial works that were translated by the British in India, or even by the Germans in India, were those of law. They wanted to understand how Indian society works, what are the laws that were in place. So, so the point is that they were really interested, because of when the British produced information and data about where are you going? Both of you together? And I think yesterday also you went. No, obviously everybody goes after every 1 hour, but okay. So, initially they suffered from this great sense of inferiority vis-a-vis the British, the West. And they felt that, my God, we have so many socially evil practices and all of that. But when literature in India got produced, and which celebrated India's past, and they discovered the rich Indian tradition that there was, and much of it is reduced by the British. There was a sense of pride that many of the Indian scholars took from it, saying that, oh, we are an ancient civilization, we are not, someone who just emerged now. And obviously something has gone wrong along the way, that our society has moved to become regressive, become a little more decadent. We need to kind of celebrate our past and seek a sense of identity and a sense of dignity from the past, the rich cultural past that we have. So there was this relationship of ambivalence vis-a-vis tradition that you find among Indian scholars. So to quote Srinivas, M.N. Srinivas, very famous, the Padma Shri, one of the few scholars in India who's got a Padma Shri, a sociologist, academician. To quote him, the greatness of India was a familiar theme with Indian politicians addressing Indian crowds. Here again it was used to rouse them to join the ranks of the fighters for national freedom, Indian freedom. But in some Indians, paleocentrism represented a flight from the harsh realities of the present. What does he mean by paleocentrism? Paleocentrism, related to paleontology, which is the study of ecology and fossils of the past, suggests an extreme idealization of Indian ancient culture. So what he argues is that there was, in this celebration of India's past, somewhere there was an overdoing of it. Indians, really kind of the new elite, sort of really harped on, what rich tradition their communities, came from, what rich tradition India as a whole had. So there was sort of, blinding yourself to what was not acceptable in Indian society. So there's only one sort of an understanding that emerges of Indian society, is that of celebration about Indian society, right? So given the overlap between the old and the new elite, this only consolidated fundamentalism in practically all communities in India. And M.N. Srinivas says that even the Parsis are not exempted from this, which is a small community in India. He said all communities, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, among all of them you find an elite that emerges, which is an educated elite, right? Distant from actually the communities that they represent. For example, Jinnah is a prime example of that, right? And you have even Hindu scholars of that kind who sort of celebrate their religion, their religious past, and sort of breed a sort of fundamentalism, which kind of contributed to the divisiveness within India that you see around 1947. Now, this is what M.N. Srinivas has said. Right? So interestingly, it's the same elite that had materially benefited from modernization. Right? So they were the ones who were talking about, oh, what a great past, we need to preserve it, we need to restore it, we need to kind of bring it back. Soni ki chidiya, na? The golden bird. Retrieve it. But what was retrieved was material welfare for themselves, but keeping that rhetoric on for the rest of the community. And in fact, one of the biggest criticisms in India and of India has been that the elite actually in India has failed India, because the elite in India really never served the interest of the larger mass of people. The elite they were not only distant from, the people of India, because they were like brown babus, who really did not know the pulse of the people, right? But also lacked a vision for India, did not have the guts, the gumption to come up with a vision of India which could radically alter India, right? So even if it is about retrieving the past, the golden beautiful past, who has done it? We only talk about it, we get to hear about it, but nobody really has done it. So there's been a huge criticism about the elite in India, which includes all of us educated people who kind of harp on our tradition, but really quite frankly in our practice of everyday life are far from it. And we are the ones who will harp most about the tradition, right? So he basically then talks about how paleocentrism then had the twofold effect. One, energizing a new nation to take the country forward, And 2, to opiate the people through revivalism and consolidating primordial identities. So you find that one, it served a brilliant purpose in kind of nation building during the freedom struggle to get the people together, and after that, for nation building purposes, right? To build the self-esteem of a new nation. On the other hand, it also consolidated primordial ties on religious and caste grounds. So caste associations, religious associations really come up 30s, 40s. You find a proliferation of caste and religious associations that come up in India. So this is a poster. I'm not totally in with it because there is Nehru in the center, but because in my reading, Nehru is not in the center. He's on one side of the picture. So but this is an interesting cartoon, so I thought I'll share it. It says the constitution makers had to address themselves to very different aspirations. Here is Nehru trying to balance between different visions and ideologies on India. Right? So one is Jana Gana Mana and the other is Vande Mataram. So you have the liberals and you have the right wing, which is like, So there is this entire tussle on what is Indian society, what is Indian tradition, what vision should we carry forward. So there are these multiple interpretations that emerge in India of what India was, what India is, and what India should be. So you find at the time of independence this sort of a confusion, and which kind of frankly has never really been resolved thereafter. So among the scholars, sociologists, my kind, so sociologists were kind of very, sociologists at that point in time were playing safe. They used to keep themselves a little away from mainstream politics. Even now they do. I think sociologists in India are largely conservative. And I say it not because I believe in it. I think sociologists themselves admit to it. And they're conservative not because they hold conservative values, because I think they have also kept themselves away from mainstream politics and policy making. Because much of the policy making is dictated by the politics I just spoke of. And it becomes very difficult for someone who's actually engaging in a ground level study to kind of find any sort of a, match in what you're thinking about Indian society and what actually you see transpires as policy. So many sociologists sort of keep away from mainstream politics. Anyway, so the presidential address of Indian Sociological Society in 1955, this was D.N. Mukherjee. The study of Indian tradition is the first immediate duty of Indian sociologists. So this is the first line that he comes up in this presidential address. Mukherjee says this. So he says it's important to understand what it is to be Indian first, understand the folkways and customs to understand what lies beneath it. So the idea that was being proposed during that conference was, listen, we claim we are traditional, but what the hell, what is Indian tradition? What is it to be Indian? What is our tradition? The British left us with this morphological structure that we are supposed to claim is ours, but is it really? What is Indian tradition all about? So there was this sort of sense of loss that many sociologists felt, and it was felt that there should be a greater study of Indian tradition and society. And that one should deepen in traditional values and cultural patterns through self-conscious engagement with tradition. I think there was also this realization at that point in time that the elites in India had distanced themselves from the mass of people in India. They did not know the pulse of the people of India, and therefore there is a need to really go back to them to understand what they consider, as tradition. So this is a quote from his it's an interesting book, D.P. Mukherjee's, 1942. The book's called Sociology of Indian Culture. It's in the library. There is such a thing as Indian culture. Non-Indians recognize its existence, and we Indians sense it. So it's there, we sense it, we know that this is what Indian culture is all about. it's palpable, but then, it's not graspable. Yeah. So there is that sense. I mean, I think this quote, I really like this quote because it really captures the feeling that even now many of us feel. Now, one of the ways in which Indian tradition was sought to be studied, and I'm taking Mukherjee's example only, was he put forward the view that there is a sense of union, if not unity, behind the diversity that characterizes India. India is not united, but there is a union of sorts. And what is it that brings this union? Or what is this common world view of Indians across religions? It's a mystical attitude. Mystical attitude is basically an attitude where you kind of fix yourself to certain permanent values to orient your everyday life. So there is sort of a part fatalism, there's a part kind of resignation to how you live your life, and optimism also in that. So he kind of compares Hindus and Muslims. I'm not going to go into details of what this book is. You can always pick it up in the library and read it. But he basically argued that Indians are oriented towards values which are considered permanent and at the top of the hierarchy of values. And this, he says, is across religions in India. And says this, and Hinduism also has undergone tremendous amount of changes through centuries. And Buddhism, Vaishnavism, medieval mystics like Kabir, Nanak, Garibdas, Chaitanya, the Panths, the sects, various sects have come out. When we do religion, I'm going to take that. We're going to talk about the sects and how they have challenged orthodoxy in various ways. Right? So mystics have contributed to art, music, literature. So according to him, much of the tradition that you see regionally and locally really is heterodoxy. It's not orthodoxy. So he says, but however, India is still associated with orthodoxy, it's associated with caste, it's associated with Brahmanism, but much of the literature, much of the art that you see, if you're in Maharashtra, you talk about the Varlis. When you go to West Bengal, you talk about the Santals. You go to various regions, you're talking about, Maithili, artists and all of there's a lot of folk kind of traditions that are in India which are not necessarily Brahmanical. So this is the argument that he makes. But he says one of the reasons but he says this didn't really bring about the change that should have happened in Indian society. That's because there was no change in the social economy. These movements only mirrored aspirations of that change, but really the ground reality or the social economy or the structure that dominated, say, the control of resources and all of that didn't change. And probably that was why after independence land reforms were introduced, with the idea of breaking into that social economy which was dominating Indian society for over 100 odd years, right? Okay, so this engagement, I just gave you an example of Mukherjee, but there were many others, some who kind of celebrated tradition and some who were very anti-tradition. The Marxist tradition was of that kind, but the Marxist tradition within sociology, ironically, has been weak. I think Marxist tradition, though we read Marx a lot, you'll find few Marxists within sociology. Which is strange, because I think economists, and I'll be killed for this, probably don't read early Marx, but there are lots of Marxists among economists, so that's the irony of things. But anyway, so you had three broad positions on tradition. One which thought that tradition should prevail, the other thought that tradition should be destroyed, we should kind of envisage a completely new forms of Indian society, and the third saying that no, it should be a sort of a coexistence of the two. So these were the three sort of, but what happened in the process was when Indian scholars started talking about tradition, the term tradition gets redefined. And how does it get redefined? It starts to connote the act of Hello? Tradition gets redefined to connote the act of handing down and what is handed over from one generation to another, and that it therefore means both the process and the products. So what was being referred to as tradition was not that timeless, static tradition that the British had spoken about, but tradition that changes with each generation, gets redefined with each generation. Living traditions, organic traditions, traditions that exist in contemporary India, but have been coming down through generations, but has changed its course, adopted new ideas along the way, brought in new technology practices in its fold. So that is the sort of tradition that Indian scholars started referring to when they spoke about tradition. So there was a reverence for the past, a past that is invoked. So you're invoking a past. So there is no one past. There are different things that you're deriving from the past. It's a very selective engagement with the past. So what I'm arguing finally here is that this sense of tradition that we are talking all along this far is then a modern phenomenon. This engagement with tradition is not really about the past. This engagement with tradition is about the present. It's about contemporary questions on how you want to see Indian society, on what perspective you hold, and therefore revisit your tradition, what you consider is your tradition in a particular way. So you should always remember that whoever talks about tradition as if it's out there, an objective reality to be kind of, taken every time you need some resource from the past, that is not so. It's your question that leads you to that past that you want to see, right? So it's not one static whole. And there's this very funny episode about M. N. Srinivas. He went to Vijayawada in 1943, and he was invited to give a lecture to this middle class group, and there was this book that came out by Catherine Mayo in 1927, which had basically really ridiculed India as this country of sexual deprivates and child marriage, infanticide, untouchability, a country which was retrograde, regressive, obscurantist, uncivilized, barbaric. Right? So there was this very strong depiction of India made by Catherine Mayo in 1927, which had become this great, controversy in India, and people had taken great objection to that book. So when M. N. Srinivas, he says he went through in that lecture that he gave a Catherine Mayo effect. And what is this Catherine Mayo effect? He said he started addressing the audience, on the middle class audience, about caste and kinship organization in India and how Indian society is and whatever. And suddenly this, a slightly senior lawyer, apparently a thick walking stick holding lawyer, which is the most, I think, important part of that, flung up like his stick up like that and said that, what do you know about tradition? Get lost, you don't know. So he says that whenever you in India you talk about tradition and you start talking about tradition a little critically, people suddenly get, and he's saying, and the funny part is that at the time that he gave this lecture, he says economists were making plans of how to rid India of poverty, and they had very sordid kind of impression of India, how India was. Political scientists were commenting on India, on how retrograde the institutions are and whether democracy will work in India. He says, but none of it gets a reaction the way when a sociologist starts to talk about Indian tradition and custom. It's so dear and near to most people because people feel that we know better, right? So this whole idea of modern and tradition, therefore, within sociology, we always argue, should not be treated as concepts that are known and are tangible or are predefined. Modern and tradition actually is an invitation to a perspective on Indian society. So it's really an attitude that you take in an understanding of Indian society. So when you say that India is traditional, you need to highlight what your perspective is and what you mean by that. So there is no one definition of tradition, there is no one definition of modern. It is just a prism, right, through which you try to understand the phenomenon that you study. All right? This is a cartoon which I found interesting. This is R.K. Lakshman, my favorite cartoonist. I'll take questions in the end. You remind me yesterday, I forgot at the end, nobody asked. It was, anyway. It's an interesting cartoon. It's about, if you remember, there was this anti-Brahmin, anti-Hindi movement that happened in the South. So there is this boy who's hitting stones, and there's one board there saying assurances, saying no Hindi, English to continue, no compulsion to learn Hindi, no Hindi, English forever, etc., etc. And he's still hitting stones at it. So then this man says, oh, the boy can't read English either. So the thing is that in the name of tradition, it evokes such emotions in India that even now, recently, when it was kind of announced that Hindi is a national language and whatever, so there was such a reaction and uproar about it, and about languages and whatever. So tradition is a very touchy topic with us. Okay, now I'll just run you through some of the key concepts through which Indian society has been understood and social change in India has been understood. Some of you who are from sociology will be very well aware of these, right? But some who are not, it's sort of an introduction to that. It was Srinivas. You've heard of these words: Sanskritization, Westernization, dominant caste. These words are basically coined by M.N. Srinivas. He's the one who popularized these words, basically with the intention of studying Indian society and studying social change in India. Right? The main purpose of this was, one, to demonstrate to the world that India has not been a static society, and in the process challenge what you call Western scholarship in India, which saw a sense of universalism in caste in India, a sort of caste being static and not unchanging, and tradition being unchanging in India. He wanted to prove them wrong. And second was also, through description, show how conflict and dissidence has been there in India, which was evident in the efforts towards mobility, right? So in this context, he brings up these three concepts. What is Sanskritization? Sanskritization is a process by which a low Hindu caste or tribal or other group changes its customs, rituals, ideology, and a way of life in the direction of a high and frequently twice born caste with a view of claiming a higher position in the caste hierarchy. Now, in medieval India, I don't know whether you've heard of the Rajgons. Gonds are a tribal community, but they came to power, I think, around the 11th and the 13th century sometime. And they had, taken up the status of Kshatriyas. Similarly with the Marathas, I think Shivaji was known to be coronated after he was heralded as a Kshatriya, right? So the efforts to kind of Sanskritize has always been there within Indian society, and usually it has been group mobility. It has very rarely been individual mobility, because this individual mobility doesn't lead you anywhere. The group has to move. So, and mostly that would happen when there would be some sort of mobility in your economic and political status. So whenever, like when the British came, there were lots of opportunities that opened up for toddy tapping communities, people who worked with leather, hide industries and all of that came up, sugar mills came up. And that's the time when many of the backward castes got an opportunity to move up the political and the social, economic ladder. When that happened, they automatically Sanskritized their ways. So some of the examples are, for example, the Ahirs, the Noniyas from UP. These are examples that are there in his book on Social Change. There are details you can read from there. It's an interesting book. But other than that, you also have someone like the Lingayats. Lingayats actually first started off by challenging Hinduism, and who were Shaivites, basically believe in Shiva and the Linga, and finally started claiming the status of Brahmins. And till very recently, they still think of themselves as Brahmin, though they have reservations now in Karnataka, but they always saw themselves on par, or in fact superior to the Brahmins. And they're very dominant in North Karnataka. If you were to go to North Karnataka, Yedurappa, you've heard of Yedurappa? Is a Lingayat. And one of the reasons why he also comes to power, because there's a strong Lingayat support base there. They are also dominant economically and politically. Right? So they also therefore claim a higher status. And that sort of you have seen. And it's also different. Sanskritization is also different from Brahminization. Brahminization is when you want to emulate the Brahmins. But mostly there are different models of Sanskritization. Sanskritization can be like a Kshatriya model. हाँ भाई आपका ध्यान किधर है? उधर क्या देख रहे हो? वो उठ रही है, उसको मैं पकड़ूंगी. आप हमारी तरफ देखिए. Right? So it's different from Brahminization. There are different models of Sanskritization. There can be a Rajput model, there can be a Brahmin model, right? Different sort of models, depending on the regional constellation of the dominant caste in where you study. Okay. Second is Westernization. Westernization refers to the changes introduced by the British in the course of their rule in India, includes values, institutions, technology and practices. So Westernization is actually a very, I feel it's a very frivolous concept. It's vague. It's not as solid as Sanskritization is as a concept. It's commonly used to refer to changes in lifestyles, dress, style of eating, mannerisms. Funnily, even Christianity is associated with Westernization. Anybody who's Christian, like for example, Goa is seen as a very westernized place, and Goa is a great haunt for most people who want to party. But I think Goa has one of the most conservative societies that you can think of. You go to South Goa, I think they're one of the most conservative group of people you can find. Very religious, church-going people, fisher folk, and completely different sense you'll get of Goa. But Christianity, by the way, came to India much before the British came. Right? And so some of them, it's also argued like when printing came and into India, and that it's part of Westernization, but it all comes from China. So the idea of Westernization is used very loosely, basically associated with the sort of, I suppose, culture that the British brought in. There was a rule of law, ideas of equality, liberty, fraternity gets introduced. All human beings are equal in front of law. These sort of values that came in with the British and also sort of encouraged men and women to go to schools and together and all of that. That sort of culture that the British brought, that was kind of associated with Westernization. And it's also distinguished from modernization. So you should not mistake Westernization with modernization. Modernization, although is seen as an offshoot of Westernization, modernization takes forward many of the features of the Western civilization in India. There's no doubting that. But modernization really comes into India in the 1950s, when a lot of money was pumped into India by the Americans to ensure that India doesn't turn communist, and to facilitate a whole lot of studies on India, to understand India's culture and tradition and where it was heading. So lot of sponsorship happened in the 50s and 60s, and many of the works that came out, which I'll be mentioning now, really happened in the course of that sort of sponsorship. So what is modernization? Modernization was a process associated with science taking precedence over emotions, sacred and the non-rational, individuals rather than the group becoming the primary unit of society and politics, associations in which people work based on achievement rather than birth, attitude of mastery rather than fatalism towards material and human environment, work separated from family, residence, community in bureaucratic organizations. So this is what modernization is, that more and more you turn to a class society which is based on achievement, it's materialistic, there's there's greater secularization, there's a distinction between family and work, religion kind of retreats into the private realm, right? Modernization is largely associated with these features which you find are already present in the West, right? So those are the features that are associated with modernization. Now, this invigorated an interest in comprehending the transition India was going through from tradition to modern. Is India actually modernizing? So, number of studies were taken up around this time. I'm not laughing. Okay. Number of studies were taken up to comprehend social mobility and change in India, and also understand whether India is modernizing at all. What is happening in India? Are people actually changing? Is achievement becoming more important than ascription? Is, birth more important than what you achieve after you're born? Or, is there greater secularization in India? Do we still interact on the basis of caste? These were the aspects that people wanted to understand. So Milton Singer, he was somebody who had great faith in India. And he says that he was somebody who was very optimistic about India, and he felt that India can be modern without being less Indian. So India can be modern with being Indian. And he tried to argue against people like Max Weber, who basically didn't see the scope of India modernizing, right? So he argued that no, there are various ways, strategies by which Indians have negotiated with modernity, with processes of modernizations, with compulsions of modern day life. So for example, if a Brahmin is attending a factory, is working in a factory, and has to rub shoulders with an untouchable or rub shoulders with somebody from a lower caste, how is he going to maintain the caste system? How is it possible? Right? So this was the question. So how do they then negotiate these, discrepancies that you have in the values that you hold and the compulsions of modern day life that doesn't allow you, For example, in modern apartments, now where you're living, earlier you will never find a latrine inside a house. Now this seems a very kind of, trivial thing. But the reason why latrines were never in the house was also because latrine is associated with pollution. And no house will have a latrine inside. Latrine would always be outside. But in big apartments now, latrines are within the house. Modern day living doesn't make this distinction between sacred and, pure and impure in that sense. So a lot of changes happen with modern life. Right? So it's in that context that he did a study of Chennai. I'll come to great tradition after that. He did a study of Chennai, Madras, to see how traditional social institutions adapt and survive the compulsions of modern society. And he identified 3 processes which he says have kind of helped caste society to adapt to modern life. One was ritual neutralization. By ritual neutralization, he meant efforts to contain the threat of pollution in the workplace. Right? So you try to kind of, ensure that you're not going into work which is highly polluting. So many of the Brahmins, this is somebody, one of my professors told me when he was studying the weavers in UP. he was saying that many of the Brahmins of the upper caste never go into the job of weaving, because in weaving you need to use your saliva to put the thread into the needle. So many of the upper castes will not go for that job, simply for that reason. Many of the women who work as domestic helps here in Mumbai will never, I will take your questions later, will never, will try to resist getting into unclean jobs. They will do cooking, some will only cook, and the ones who clean the bathrooms will not be given the job of cooking ever. Very rarely will you find this sort of interchangeability of work, right? Second is vicarious ritualization. Many of the functions, for example, the Brahmins has to do an elaborate puja. Many of that function was transferred to women. Their women. And so the women would do those, would fulfill those obligations, those ritual obligations that the men couldn't do when they went to work. And this you find even in Leela Dubey. She's written on caste and gender, and she talks about it. How a lot of the women, say in areas like Uttaranchal and all, where men migrate, you would find the women taking on these jobs, these ritual practices, so that the family obligation is fulfilled. Then is the ritual compartmentalization, temporal and spatial segregation of traditional and modern contexts. So this kind of reminds me of an example of this Brahmin who used to go to work in a factory, and when he would come back, he would enter the house from the backyard, and there would be a bucket and water kept for him separately, where he would wash himself, clean himself, and then enter the house. So this sort of a compartmentalization, is very typical. Now coming to this whole notion of great and little tradition, Malcolm Marriott popularized this term called great and little tradition, saying India does not have one tradition. There are multiple traditions in India. Great tradition is the classical tradition, universal tradition. Say, for example, the epics. But even there's a question mark. For example, in the south, Ramayana has become popular now. Right? Ramayana was not so popular in the south as much as it was in the north. Right? But still, great tradition is associated with the universal classical Sanskritic tradition. Little tradition is basically folk tradition, regional specific. Right? And Malcolm Marriott's concept of universalization and parochialization really shows how little and great tradition, there's a crisscrossing of things. For example, Santoshima or Tirupati, these were regional traditions. These were never the part of great tradition. But now I think Tirupati is a part of great tradition. I think even Balaji Telefilms, has, made Tirupati universal. I mean, not just them, but the fact that Tirupati is now visited by as many North Indians as South Indians. Santoshima similarly. Santoshima, suddenly Vaishno Devi is a place where I have my relatives. Every year there's a batch that will go to Vaishno Devi, trekking to Vaishno Devi, and poor South Indians unable to bear the cold, but see it as a part of pilgrimage and do it. Right? So this process of universalization and parochialization. Parochialization is when great tradition enters little tradition, and universalization is when little tradition circulates upward into tradition, great tradition. Little tradition circulates, I have given you an example. When great tradition enters the little tradition, I think Sanskritization is a classic example of that. Notions of purity and pollution is a classic example of that. The Brahminical tradition, the Sanskritic tradition, entering the non-Sanskritic traditions. Right? Similarly, you have S.C. Dubey, who really talks about various kinds of traditions, interestingly, which is classical, regional, local, subcultural, emergent nationalist tradition. Emergent nationalist traditions include flag hoisting. We have modern traditions, which are considered as sacred. Tradition is part of how you create your sacred, right? So you have these sort of traditions, new traditions that have come up. So what you have that comes up at this time is this sort of a confused picture about India, So there is this lady who's saying, a white lady I suppose, who's saying that this, dear children, is India, the mysterious land of tigers, snake charmers, doctors and engineers. So there is this whole contradiction about India, that India is this place which is traditional and is continuing to hold on to tradition vicariously by neutralizing it through create a little tradition, and yet you have doctors and engineers, and it's looking towards the 21st century and already into it. Right? This is a good example of compartmentalization. This tech support person says she hopes I'm of the caste she can talk to. So, it's an interesting, it came in the Wall Street Journal, so obviously it must be serious stuff. Dominant caste. Dominant caste is a concept I think all of you are aware of. And one of the most popular concepts coined by M.N. Srinivas. Dominant caste is a numerically dominant caste which is high on secular status, political power, political and economic power. This concept was used to comprehend the rise in the secular status following independence due to little franchise, land reforms, or even regional development. So there are these two studies. I will share in the Moodle both these articles. One by Andrea Bette. It's a part of a book, but it also came out in EPW, a sort of a concise piece on it, which I will circulate. And by Anand Chakravarti. Andrea Bette's study really looks at how in Shripuram, in Tanjore or Tanjavur, the Brahmins lost their prominence, and how the non-Brahmin communities, through land reform, they got power, and also because of their numerical dominance, sort of came to dominate. So how power shifts from the Agraharam is the place where the Brahmins stay, to the Panchayat office, which was outside of the Agraharam, right? So that sort of shift he kind of depicts and shows how, and also among the extant untouchables, there was a movement for self-respect that kind of politicized them, and there was sort of a change in the political scenario in the village that he studied. And second is a study of Anand Chakravarti, study of Purnia, Bihar, where he talks about the Rajput and the Bhumihars, who are the major landholders, and then there are the Kurmis and the Koiris, who are the OBCs, the other backward classes, who gain some land during land reform. And then there is the underclass, right? Underclass are basically the ex-untouchables who basically engage in drudge labor. He calls their labor drudge labor. They're literally treated like slaves and are not given remunerative prices for their labor. It's almost like bonded labor. So he talks about it, and he argues how caste and class in Bihar continues to overlap. Right? So wherever the dominant caste as a concept has become important, it has become important in two ways. One, where this overlap between caste and class has been ruptured, as in the case of Tamil Nadu. You'll find very few Brahmins in rural areas in Tamil Nadu now. Much of the service castes in rural India, the uppermost and the lowermost, seek to migrate out of rural India. I think it is almost like lack of availability of employment and also falling of status has led to many of them leaving rural India, right? And the other is where caste and class overlaps. In the case of Bihar, where these dominant castes have taken over the coercive role of the state, where there is the privatization of the coercive role of the state. And somewhere they have taken over state power, have their own militias, and are actually running parallel sort of governments of sorts. So they are the dominant caste there's an extreme example of dominant caste that you find in his case study, and both really highlight the politics around dominant caste. Dominant caste, initially when it came out, was seen as a liberating factor, but it has somehow again become a more hegemonic concept over the years, right? Now, Sanskritization and Westernization is a related concept, though I presented it as two separate concepts. What happened in India is that as lower castes, with improvement in secular status in terms of economic status or whatever, took to Sanskritization, large mass of the upper caste took to Westernization. So somehow this continue to maintain their distinction. And I will also circulate this article by Harold Gould, where he shows how that happened. He studied this particular village in UP, in Faizabad, called Sherupur. He's changed the name of the village for confidentiality. And that particular village, he shows how, much of the upper caste have westernized themselves, while the lower caste have Sanskritized themselves. And the caste system in the process sort of continues. It really does not demolish the system at all. And Sanskritization is also an interesting concept because it helps explain this transition from the old to the new, this relationship. Because with Westernization, you find a class of elite that emerges, which really is not questioning the caste system, but really emerging to maintain its distinction. You understand what I'm saying? So Sanskritization and Westernization has only consolidated the caste system. Westernization has only helped in consolidate the caste system rather than break the caste system. And so there have been criticisms of this concept, and M.N. Srinivas has really kind of been bombarded for this concept because it only talks about positional change in the caste system, not structural change in the caste system. And it's considered as a soft concept, failing to capture the ugly dimensions of conflict. Because there is violence, honor killings that you see every now and then in rural India, even in urban India, right? And so Sanskritization as a concept is not able to capture that, so it's been criticized. So, and of course, one other criticism that is against Sanskritization is what I have already mentioned, is how the concept also shows that how the Indian elite really did not evolve into this, this class of leadership to take India forward. Right? So the elite has failed to envisage the future of India. So this Westernization and Sanskritization as concepts, if you study, you realize how our elite have emerged. It has not been a radical break from the caste system of the past, but actually a continuity of it. So it's very fascinating for that reason. Okay, so the continuity in change, I don't know whether you can read it. So here, India's traditional corporate ladder, they've shown, they've described who Brahmins are, then there is these examples of Brahmins that are mentioned there in terms of continuity. God, even I find it difficult to read it. So it basically talks about Jawaharlal Nehru and Rahul Dravid as the cricketer, who's like a Brahmin. So in contemporary India, showing the ladder. And then there is the Kshatriya, which is Vasundhara Raje Scindia. So her name is there. Then there is the Vaishya, Mittal, Lakshmikant Mittal, and there are very many examples. Then there's also Gandhi, and then among the Shudras, I can't see the name. And then among the Dalits, there's Ambedkar, of course, that they have mentioned. So they've shown how, that there is sort of a continuity and yet there is a change. That even from the lowest caste, you still find achievers. Whereas there's in the upper castes, the Vaishya, Kshatriya and Shudra, there also, there's a continuity of the domination of those categories in contemporary India. So this sort of kind of models on that. In recent times, Andre Bete has argued that publicly caste has lost, its initial impetus, what it had, the position that it had. It is no longer about hierarchy, it's no longer about untouchability, it's no longer about discrimination, because publicly you cannot afford to do that anymore. So there is a public dissolval of caste, right? So since that is there, because one, the constitution doesn't allow you, at least there are constitutional provisions. Of course there are violation of those constitutional, the mandate, but still the constitution has categorically kind of denied discrimination on the basis of caste. Reformers of Hinduism, however orthodox you might find them, have undermined caste hierarchy, whether it's the Arya Samaj, right? Caste is not considered, even in the RSS, although of course there are studies now which says that caste is a very fundamental feature of RSS, but in its principal stand, seeks to kind of resolve the contradictions in the hierarchy within the Hindu caste system to build a monolithic Hindu identity. And that has been the prime mover of an organization like RSS also. So somewhere, even in Hinduism also, caste hierarchy per se has been questioned. So the orientation towards caste, according to Andre Bette, he takes some middle ground, saying it has changed since the middle of the 19th century. But then how does caste perpetuate itself? According to him, it is because of institutions like family and kinship. In the private realm, it is left the public realm, but is prevalent and thriving in the private realm, and that is how caste continues, according to him. And these are institutions that you will be studying in the next lecture. So this is one cartoon where the father is telling his daughter, Indian, American, Canadian, Pakistani, we don't care who you marry, so long as he's a Brahmin. So, and this is a story which is true for many households, where parents are very worried who are their daughter. They don't want to send their children far away to study precisely for this reason, because they're scared कि किसको पकड़ के ले आएंगे, and who she's going to catch hold of and get home. So hold her back and let her be near us. So there is always this fear, especially for a girl. It's a big thing. If a boy marries, it's not such a big issue as a girl marrying, because there is somewhere women are associated with greater danger, always. Okay. This is the second reason why caste persists. And this cartoon says, no sir, this is neither a flood hit nor a drought hit area. We are only hit by bad government. So when the state, this is my favorite cartoonist. Anyway, great man. When the state fails to bring about the changes that it's supposed to do, community supports. The number of, if you're ever interested, please do a study in Mumbai of caste associations, in the way in which it supports its youngsters for higher education, the way it kind of funds that, the point is, much of the role of the state has been taken over by the community. When a poor person migrates into Mumbai and gets like a meager salary of 6,000 or 7,000 a month, how is that person supposed to survive in a place like Mumbai? The state doesn't provide anything. On the other hand, will also throw him out. They survive because they have kins. They have some extended family here who kind of subsidize their stay, support them in ways that they're still able to save money and send it back home. So I think one of the reasons why many of our institutions are really caught and are not really able to break, they do not break, because they're obviously also providing certain positive functions that we fail to recognize. And I think the private realm of Indians is what is harboring, this sort of what we consider as conservatism, but there are certain reasons for those. Right? Among the upper caste or whatever, the well-off communities, I suppose it is to protect themselves. And those who are on the lower end, it's really about surviving, how well you can survive. Okay? So this is more or less, I'm going to just 2-3 slides and wind up. So obviously since then there has been a shift in the way India has been looked at. So all this while I was really talking about, since the British, wake up everyone, since the British nationalist scholars, 60s, 70s, they were still trying to understand processes of change in India. What is India all about? What is Indianness? Is there an Indian tradition? Oh, there is no one Indian tradition. There are multiple traditions. Oh, there is continuity and change. We are changing, we are modernizing, and yet we are traditional. So there's a whole lot of hodgepodge that happens to a point where we come and say that, okay, look, somehow something has changed in the public realm, but we still persist to be traditional. Now there comes a point in the 80s, 90s, you find that scholars are fed up with this, because this whole argument of modernization is a dead end. Why is it a dead end? Because it's like, I was born after my brother, I will always be younger, isn't it? So similarly, India, in order to modernize, if saying we're modernizing, we'll always be modernizing. Because as we are modernizing, the modern world is anyway going further ahead. So we are still trying to keep pace, and you're constantly modern. So it's like you're caught in that transition. So you're always living in transition. There's this famous tagline which is always associated with India in transition. We are forever in transit. We are not reaching a destination. We can't even go back. We are in, what we call the Trishanku Swarg. Somewhere in between. Happy in our own realm, we don't know what is happening. Anyway, so despite emotive, intuitive appeal of titles such as When a Great Tradition Modernized, this is the title that Milton Singer had given his book, which I find very kind of flowery. When a great tradition modernizes, it has been difficult to define an authentic account of Indian culture. What is Indian culture, right? Modernization proved to be a conceptual dead end. India is always in transition. Focus has been on focus should be on how things are changing as against change per se. So when everybody, there was this feeling among scholars that why are we trying to understand what is that thing that is changing in India? How is India changed? Is India modern? Is India tradition? Instead of getting into that kind of quandary, we should focus more on how things are changing. Not just caste, gender, family, religion, not the morphological structure of Indian society, but also streets, bazaars, courts, panchayats, municipal office, schools, corporates, offices, temples, they're all changing. So when you see that, you realize temple, schools, courts, temple being a traditional institution, runs, Tirupati runs like a modern organization. You know that, right? It supports many colleges, schools, it has hospitals. And if you go to a court of law, you still know that even though it's a modern institution, paisa chalta hai, caste matters, who you are matters, your position matters, isn't it? So you realize that modern institutions are as traditional institutions are as modern. And you realize there's this sacrosanct divide between tradition and modern institutions in India has collapsed. Institutions such as panchayats, which are modern institutions, are very traditional in their functioning. Institutions such as temples are pretty modern in their functioning. Right? Caste is no longer hierarchical, but there is exploitation. So there is this whole hodgepodge. So the idea is that let's not go into whether we are traditional or modern, but let's try and understand the nature of change of things in India, of these spaces that we inhabit in our everyday lives. Right? So move from an obsession of the past to events of the present to comprehend how tradition is evoked in the politics that ensue. So for example, if there's the 1984 riots, and this apology that was asked from Rahul Gandhi on TV, you remember that interview, famous interview? Interview where much was not said. And an apology was sought from Rahul Gandhi, and he said, I don't even know about it, and was a kid, and whatever. The fact is that each time that event is spoken of, it evokes a politics of tradition, right? And modern. And all of these issues of community, of state, of various political actors. Community is also a political actor. Communities also have stake. The politics of reservation is nothing but the politics of communities, isn't it? Right? And when you study these events and you study contemporary India, you realize, you look at them as sites, you realize that culture is contested. There is no consensus on Indian culture. It's contested. Everybody is taking claims, including the state and communities. Everybody is taking a claim. Traditions are subject to multiple appropriations and deployment. For example, in identity-based politics, festivals, customs, beliefs. You are here in Mumbai now, Ganpati is not very far, Ganesh Chaturthi is going to happen, soon you'll have the pandas that are going to come up. You've heard of these pandas? Right? Ganesh festival in Mumbai is a huge affair. There's festivity all around. And I would suggest you even take time and visit some of those. And you realize the amount of money, even Gokulashtami, the amount of money political parties pour in, right, into all of these festivals, and the way caste politics, regional politics is played out, you will see that. Identity-based politics, similarly, multiple appropriations, right? Ambedkar is appropriated by everybody. Now even Gandhi is appropriated by the BJP. A much hated character by much of the right wing at one point in time has been appropriated by the BJP, isn't it? So, point is that there is multiple appropriation that happens of symbols. So you need to take back the story with you in terms of how do you then comprehend the question of tradition modern India, and I would beg that you kind of don't take a very typical stereotypical position on it and really have a more nuanced understanding of how the politics of tradition modern, plays out in the context of the events around you. Now this is the last thing I'm leaving it with you, and I will read it out to you for who can't read it. There is this Kathakali dancer who's coming out, and there's a white lady who's fainted. It's a tourist office. And this person is saying that I think we would do well to cut out this idea of welcoming the visitors in our cultural costumes. So there is this stereotyping that we do of India all the time, and I think we need to stop it, and I think we have moved far ahead from what we think we are. So thank you.